Well, one of the objections we often hear online today as we're kind of discussing and sharing our faith is you can't trust the Bible because the Bible is full of errors. It was written by Constantine 400 years after as a Roman document to kind of to establish his own empire, so on and so on. All these kinds of arguments are out there. But please could you spend a little time discussing the three key tests for the authenticity of the scriptures? I believe you call them the composition test, the companion test, and the corroboration test. And could you explain why we can trust the Holy Bible today?
Yeah, this is a great question. I've actually tweaked the names of these as I thought about more and found a way that I think is even more memorable, but keeps the three C's that you are referring to.
Okay.
The first one is C for character. Do we have reason to believe we can trust the character of the writers? And one way we start is the biblical writers consistently say over and over again, we're reporting truth, we're eyewitnesses, we investigated this carefully. So at least minimally, they claim to be reporting truth. But then you look internally at the writings of, say, the Gospels, and we find this embarrassing material that they give. Now, why is embarrassing material like the disciples falling asleep 3 times when Jesus says, stay awake? Embarrassing material like the disciples not understanding the teaching of Jesus. Embarrassing material like the women discovering the empty tomb. And that culture that was patriarchal, that was embarrassing that the women would discover this and the men fled. Now, why this is significant is historians have something called the criterion of embarrassment, that if a writer includes material that is embarrassing or disparaging to his or her own character, this tells the critical historian, here's a writer that's concerned more about truth than preserving his or her own reputation. That is one sign of integrity as a good historical writer. And we see that all over the New Testament. You see it in the Old Testament some, and in particular in the Gospels. So this adds to the character of the apostles. The final thing that I think is convincing is that the apostles were willing to suffer and die for the belief that they had seen the risen Jesus. Now, I did my entire doctoral dissertation on this and published an academic book, so I won't even begin to go into the details here, nor do I think you want me to. But the bottom line is, we know they believed from early, within just a few years of the death of Jesus, that they had seen the risen Jesus. We know they intentionally put themselves in harm's way for the proclamation of that message. They're beaten, they're threatened, thrown in prison, and some of them are killed, and they refuse to stop preaching this message. That tells me minimally that they really believe what they're proclaiming is true. They didn't make this up. They're not liars. So that's a quick summary of the C, the character test. I think we have reason to believe that the writers care about truth.
Yeah.
The second C, I've shifted to what I call the copy test.
Okay.
Because these books were written down 2,000 years ago, and they've been copied and copied and copied and copied. How do we know what we have today represents what was originally written down? Now, there's a lot of different ways to come at this question, but one way some textual critics will appeal to is the number of manuscripts we have and how early those manuscripts are. And if you just compare the biblical texts, again, New Testament and the Gospels, we have greater quantity and also earlier copies than other ancient books that almost no one that I'm aware of questions the authenticity of how they've been copied and passed on. Yeah. So you even have classical scholars that don't believe in the inspiration of the scriptures, saying there is tremendous care with these documents that really stands on its own 2 feet, textually speaking. Now, with that said, there's some debate about particular passages in the Bible. We're not sure what the original words are in a few isolated passages, but as a whole, textually speaking, I think we have a high degree of confidence that not only, number one, did the writers care about reporting truth, but that these books have been copied carefully with an eye for accuracy over the past 2,000 years. The third C, so we have character, we have copy. The third C I now call, which is the same on the list you had, is corroboration. Is there evidence outside the book that confirms the internal claims? And there's 2 ways we could look at this. Number one, we could look at other writers. And so you have Jewish writers like Josephus, the end of the 1st century. Roman writers like Tacitus, early 2nd century. You have other Christian writers like Clement of Rome and Ignatius who confirm many of the core details we have in the Gospels. Not all of them, but the existence of Jesus, the death of Jesus, that people worshiped him as God, etc. You get the basic storyline corroborated in other writings. But the other piece of corroboration would be the archaeological evidence. And there, again, archaeology doesn't prove something's true, but it helps corroborate. For example, years skeptics said there's no evidence that somebody was crucified the way that Jesus was. Well, in John, Thomas wants to see the nails, marks in the hands and feet of Jesus, indicating he was crucified with nails. But all the crucified victims we had found were crucified with rope or some other means. Until in the 1960s, in a tomb in the 1st century, somebody was found having been crucified with nails. And now there's 2 other possible cases that are being investigated that look possible, and some would argue even probable, of 1st century or roughly around the 1st century crucified victims that would match the depiction in the Gospels.
Wow.
Now, I teach at Bible. We have like full semesters going into detail on this. But the bottom line is I think we have reason to trust the character of the writers. We have reason to believe it's been copied faithfully. And we find good corroboration in archaeology and ancient documents, which minimally tells us we have good reason to trust that the writers report truth.
And I've heard Dr. William Lane Craig say as well that we are 99% certain of the words, I believe, in the New Testament. It's just a 1% kind of margin.
I've heard people go, to be more, to be conservative, to say, well, maybe 97%.
Okay.
Others would say 99% plus. So what he said, as far as I know, is virtually agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars, that there's a few small areas of debate. But what's also interesting about this is a lot of textual critics I talk to will say, we know the words of Jesus are out there. We're in the text. We're just trying to decipher in a few smaller cases exactly what those words are. And by the way, that 1% that Dr. Craig was referring to, none of that has anything to do with a core doctrine of the Christian faith. Doesn't mean it's unimportant, but it's not like we don't know that Jesus resurrected or claimed to be God or something of that nature.
Sure.